The evening had started like any other business dinner, but I knew it would end differently. As I sat across from my husband James at the Capital Grille in downtown Seattle, watching him nervously check his phone for the 5th time, I couldn't help but smile. The waiter approached with an expensive bottle of Château Lafite Rothschild 1982, James's typical show of wealth. "A special celebration," he announced, his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit unable to hide the slight tremor in his hands. If only he knew that I had already seen the wedding invitation draft on his laptop, carefully hidden in a folder labeled Property Acquisition 2025. To us, he raised his glass, his green eyes meeting mine with what I once thought was love, but now recognized as mere calculation. I lifted my glass in response, the diamond on my finger catching the light. A ring bought with money from my family's trust, though he'd always let others believe it was his success that paid for such luxuries. And to new beginnings, I added softly, watching his expression flicker with uncertainty. The irony was delicious. While he'd been planning his secret wedding to Olivia Parker, the young interior designer he'd hired for our Mercer Island property, he'd forgotten one crucial detail. Every major asset in his supposedly successful real estate empire was tied to my family's trust. I had spent the last 3 months quietly orchestrating the most spectacular financial unraveling Seattle's elite social circle would ever witness. If you've been captivated by this story of empowerment and justice, don't forget to subscribe to join our community that celebrates strength, resilience, and the power of standing up for yourself. Hit that notification bell to never miss an update. We're just getting started. The candlelight danced across the white tablecloth as I watched James attempt to maintain his composure. He was good at that, maintaining appearances. It was what had drawn me to him 5 years ago when we met at a charity gala. His charm, his vision for Wilson and Bennett development, his seemingly unstoppable ambition. What I hadn't realized then was that his greatest talent wasn't in building properties, but in building lies. I took a calculated sip of the wine, remembering the moment everything changed. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when Sophie, my best friend and corporate lawyer, had called me into her office. "Emma, there's something you need to see," she'd said, sliding a folder across her desk. Inside were photos of James and Olivia touring wedding venues at the Four Seasons, along with preliminary contracts dated for next month. The same month he'd told me he needed to be in Dubai for an essential business development trip. The marriage license application was what really made me laugh. He'd listed himself as the primary property owner of our Mercer Island mansion, the downtown development project, and even the summer house in the Hamptons. All assets that were, in reality, secured through my family's trust, which my father had insisted I maintain sole control over, despite James's repeated attempts to consolidate our finances. As I sat there in the Capital Grille, watching him check his watch again, I thought about all the nights I'd spent reviewing contracts with Robert Hayes, our family's financial advisor. "Your father was wise to structure things this way," Robert had said, helping me quietly document every instance where James had leveraged my family's assets for his own gains. The paper trail was immaculate, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. "How's the Parker Street development coming along?" I asked innocently, knowing full well that the property wasn't just a business venture anymore. It was where he'd been meeting Olivia for their secret rendezvous. The contractor I'd hired had kept detailed logs of every visit, every long lunch, every late-night planning session that had nothing to do with floor plans. "Everything's on schedule," James, I replied smoothly, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He'd always been proud of his poker face, had built his reputation on being unreadable in negotiations, but I'd learned to read between the lines, to see the tells he thought he'd mastered. Just like I'd learned to read between the lines of bank statements, property deeds, and investment portfolios. Marcus Bennett, James's business partner, had unexpectedly become an ally in my investigation. He'd arrived at my office one rainy morning, looking uncomfortable in his usually confident demeanor. "I can't be part of this," he'd said, laying out evidence of how James had been manipulating company books to finance his new life with Olivia. The loyalty of business partners, it seemed, had its limits. My fingers traced the stem of my wine glass as I prepared for what would come next. In less than 24 hours, James would discover that every property he'd been using as collateral for his new ventures had been quietly transferred back, under the direct control of the Thompson Family Trust. His access to our joint investment portfolio would be severed, and the carefully constructed house of cards he'd built would come crashing down spectacularly. "You seem distracted tonight," I observed, watching him try to maintain his usual confident smile. If he only knew that at this very moment, Sophie was meeting with the bank's board of directors, presenting irrefutable evidence of financial misrepresentation. By tomorrow morning, James Wilson would be not just a cheater, but a man without an empire. The atmosphere in the Capital Grille shifted as other diners began filtering in for the evening service. I watched the maitre d' escort a young couple to their table, their faces glowing with genuine affection, so different from the calculated facade James maintained across from me. The warm lighting and rich mahogany panels that had once felt romantic now seemed to cast long shadows, much like the secrets between us. James adjusted his silver cufflinks, a 5th anniversary gift I'd given him just months ago, while perusing the menu with feigned interest. The waiter approached again, and James ordered the Wagyu beef with his usual authority. I chose the Awa seared scallops, remembering how he'd once told me they were Olivia's favorite during a project dinner I'd been too busy to attend. The gentle clink of silverware and murmured conversations around us provided the perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. Robert Hayes had called earlier today with the final confirmation. Every document was in place, every signature verified, every transaction tracked. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, considering the substantial withdrawal James had attempted to make yesterday from our joint investment account. "The Anderson project is looking promising," James mentioned casually, reaching for his phone again. I knew he wasn't checking updates about any property development. The wedding planner, a mutual acquaintance who'd felt morally obligated to contact me, had confirmed his final venue walkthrough was scheduled for tomorrow morning. "Speaking of promising ventures," I replied, maintaining eye contact as I reached for my clutch, "I had an interesting meeting with Marcus today." The slight tightening of his jaw told me everything I needed to know. Marcus had always been the more cautious of the two, maintaining detailed records of every transaction, every agreement, every deviation from their official business plans. A well-dressed woman at the bar caught my attention. Her elegant posture reminded me of my mother's warning years ago. "Men like James," she'd said. "They don't build empires. They marry them." I'd dismissed her words then, blinded by James's charisma and apparent business acumen. Now I understood she'd seen what I hadn't, the careful way he'd positioned himself. Within Seattle's elite circles, always leveraging connections, always climbing higher, the sommelier approached with another bottle of wine, one James had ordered earlier. I watched him taste it with the sophistication he'd cultivated over years of business dinners and charity events. Each gesture was perfectly calculated, just like his plans for the upcoming wedding. What he didn't know was that Sophie had already spoken with the Four Seasons management, armed with proof of fraudulent financial declarations he'd made to secure the venue. "The Thompson Investment Group board meeting went well today," I mentioned, noting how his attention suddenly sharpened. He'd been trying to gain a seat on that board for months, unaware that my father's colleagues had long seen through his carefully constructed veneer. "They're particularly interested in the allocation of recent development funds." James's hand paused halfway to his wine glass, a momentary break in his usual smooth movements. The look in his eyes shifted from confidence to something else, the first flicker of uncertainty I'd seen since discovering the wedding plans. He recovered quickly, but not before I caught the slight tremor in his fingers as he reached for his water instead. The gentle symphony of dinner service continued around us, but the air between us had grown thick with unspoken tensions. a couple. At the next table celebrated what appeared to be an anniversary, their genuine joy a stark contrast to our choreographed performance. James glanced at them briefly, and I wondered if he felt any remorse about planning his new life while pretending to maintain ours. My phone buzzed quietly, a message from Sophie confirming that the final documents had been filed with the county clerk's office. Tomorrow morning, when James arrived for his wedding venue walkthrough, he would instead find himself facing a very different kind of meeting. The thought brought a slight smile to my face, one that James misinterpreted as appreciation for the expensive wine he'd ordered. "The Parker Street development has really turned a corner," he continued, unaware that I knew exactly what, or rather who, had been occupying his time there. The property that he'd claimed would be his masterpiece would instead become the stage for his greatest downfall. Every private meeting, every long lunch, every late-night planning session had been meticulously documented, creating a pattern that even his most loyal supporters couldn't ignore. As our main courses arrived, I watched him cut into his Wagyu beef with the precision he applied to everything in his life. Control. That's what James had always craved. Control over his image, his business ventures, his relationships. But he'd made one critical mistake, underestimating the woman who had quietly enabled his rise to prominence in Seattle's real estate circles. The scallops on my plate were perfectly seared, each one a small reminder of the careful preparation that had gone into this evening. Like them, every element of my plan had been precisely timed, methodically arranged, waiting for the right moment. James had always prided himself on his strategic thinking, but he'd forgotten that I'd learned from the best, my father, whose business acumen had built the very foundation James had tried to claim as his own. The evening progressed with the same polished veneer that had characterized our marriage for the past 5 years. But beneath the surface, currents of change were already in motion. Tomorrow, James would discover just how completely he had miscalculated. The empire he thought he'd built would crumble, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet efficiency of properly executed legal documents and financial transfers. The first warning signs appeared as subtle as the changing seasons. Like leaves turning color before autumn, James's behavior shifted in ways only someone intimately familiar with his patterns would notice. The way he positioned his laptop screen away from me when working from home, how his phone always lay face down on his desk, the sudden increase in essential client meetings that ran late into the evening. Our penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle, once a testament to our shared success, became a stage where we both played our parts. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated the space where James paced during his phone calls, now always taken in hushed tones on the balcony. The marble countertops in our kitchen reflected his untouched coffee cups, evidence of breakfasts missed due to increasingly early departures. It was during one of these quiet mornings that I first noticed the receipt from Cartier tucked carelessly in his suit jacket, a purchase that never made its way to my jewelry box. The amount matched the mysterious withdrawal from our joint account, one of many financial breadcrumbs he'd been leaving behind. Each discovery was like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. Sophie's words echoed in my mind as I observed these changes. "Watch the money," she'd advised during one of our lunch meetings. "People lie, but bank statements tell stories they never intended to share." The irony wasn't lost on me. James had always praised my financial acumen when it benefited his ventures, never imagining those same skills would illuminate his deception. The Wilson and Bennett Development Office became a treasure trove of information. Each visit to bring James lunch revealed new details. The way Olivia's design presentations always seemed to run overtime, how their heads would bend close together, over property plans, the lingering glances when they thought no one was watching. The same office where James had once proudly displayed our wedding photo now held subtle hints of a future he was planning without me. Marcus's conscience finally broke during a charity gala at the Seattle Art Museum. Between auction bids and champagne toasts, he pulled me aside into a quiet gallery. Surrounded by abstract paintings worth millions, he revealed how James had been reallocating funds, using the Thompson family's assets as leverage for properties intended for his new life. The bold strokes of color on the canvas behind him seemed to mirror the bold strokes of James's deception. The signs became clearer in our social circle. At dinner parties, James's hand no longer rested casually on my lower back. During charity board meetings, his chair gradually moved further from mine. Even his mother's behavior changed, her usual warm embraces replaced by awkward pauses and averted eyes. She knew something, but loyalty to her son kept her silent. Robert Hayes proved invaluable during this time. Over lengthy meetings in his wood-paneled office, we traced the web of financial decisions James had made. Each document revealed a new layer of his plan: properties purchased under shell companies, investments redirected through obscure channels, all leading toward a future that didn't include me. The trust my father had insisted upon maintaining separate from our marital assets now seemed less like paternal control and more like prescient wisdom. The Thompson Investment Group's quarterly meeting provided another piece of the puzzle. James attended virtually, citing a site visit that couldn't be rescheduled. The same afternoon, a junior associate mentioned seeing him at the Four Seasons, deep in conversation with a wedding planner known for her discretion and elaborate events. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I had suspected, but hadn't wanted to confirm. Our home security system logged his late-night arrivals, each one marked by the soft ping of notifications on my phone. The timestamps matched perfectly with the schedule of private showing at the Parker Street property. Showings that appeared in no official documentation, but were carefully noted by the security guard who owed his position to my father's recommendation. Even our favorite restaurants held clues. The maitre d' at Canlis, who had known us since our engagement, mentioned seeing James dining there on evenings when he was supposedly in Portland for business meetings. The reservation had been under Parker. Not exactly subtle, but then James had always underestimated how much people notice, how many quiet allies I had in places he took for granted. The changes in his wardrobe spoke volumes. New suits I hadn't seen him purchase, a different cologne that lingered on his shirts when they returned from the dry cleaners. Small details that might have seemed insignificant in isolation, but together painted a picture of a man preparing for a new chapter. A chapter he thought he could write while still maintaining control of the life we'd built together. My own preparations were equally detailed but far more discreet. Each discovery was carefully documented, every transaction traced, every witness statement recorded. Sophie's legal expertise ensured that every move we made was unassailable. While James orchestrated his secret wedding, I orchestrated something far more intricate: the systematic dismantling of the financial empire he thought he controlled. The Seattle rain provided a fitting backdrop to these revelations, each gray day matching the gradual unraveling of what I'd thought was a solid marriage. But unlike the weather, this wasn't a natural progression. It was a calculated deception that required an equally calculated response. As I watched him leave for another late meeting, I knew the time for passive observation was coming to an end. The security footage from the Parker Street property arrived in my email each evening, courtesy of the system James himself had insisted on installing. Each file showed the same pattern: his car arriving just minutes after Olivia's, their shadows moving behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of what was supposed to be a model unit. The timestamps matched perfectly with the times his wedding planner had logged for venue visits and menu tastings. In his rush to plan his new future, James had forgotten the fundamental rule of Seattle's real estate world: relationships matter more than money. The network of connections I'd built over years of charity work and board meetings proved invaluable. Each person who came forward with information, each document shared over quiet coffee meetings, each whispered conversation at gallery openings, all of it contributed to my understanding of just how completely James had underestimated me. The revelation came on a Tuesday afternoon when Seattle's typical gray skies had momentarily given way to unexpected sunshine. I sat in Sophie's corner office at her law firm, 40 floors above the city streets, as she carefully laid out a series of documents across her desk. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated each page like a spotlight on an unwanted truth. "You need to see this, Emma," Sophie said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who knew they were about to shatter a friend's world. The folder she pushed across her glass desk contained more than just papers. It held the evidence of James's most elaborate deception yet. Wedding venue contracts, catering agreements, and a detailed timeline for a ceremony scheduled at the Four Seasons, all bearing his signature alongside Olivia's. My hands remained steady as I lifted each document, years of boardroom negotiations having taught me the value of maintaining composure. The wedding was planned for exactly 1 month. From today, the same week James had scheduled his supposed business trip to Dubai. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd chosen the same hotel where we'd celebrated our own engagement 5 years ago. The afternoon light cast long shadows across Sophie's office as she pulled up additional documentation on her computer. Property, transfers, strategic investments, and careful movements of assets, all orchestrated by James over the past 6 months. He'd been methodically preparing for a future that didn't include me, yet relied entirely on resources that belonged to my family's trust. "There's more," Sophie said, turning her monitor toward me. Security footage from the Parker Street development showed James and Olivia entering the penthouse suite together, not for property tours or design consultations, but for intimate dinners and long evenings that extended well past business hours. The timestamp on one video matched exactly with the night he'd told me he was stuck in emergency meetings with overseas investors. My mind wandered to the morning James had first introduced Olivia as the interior designer for our new development project. She'd stood in our office with her portfolio, all perfectly curated designs and practiced professionalism. I remembered thinking how young she looked, how eager to prove herself in Seattle's competitive real estate market. Now I understood that her ambitions extended far beyond interior design. The sound of traffic below filled the silence as I continued reading through the documents. Each page revealed a new layer of deception, how James had been gradually transferring assets, setting up new accounts, and creating a financial framework for his new life. He'd even begun the process of establishing a separate business entity, one that would operate independently from Wilson and Bennett Development. "He's been careful," Sophie noted, her legal training evident in how she'd organized the evidence. But he made one crucial mistake. She pointed to a series of transactions that all traced back to the Thompson family trust. In his haste to build his new life, James had forgotten that his access to these funds was contingent on our marriage. Even more importantly, he'd overlooked the fact that I retained sole control over the trust's major assets. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across Seattle's skyline as Sophie outlined the extent of James's plans. He'd arranged everything meticulously, from the private ceremony to the honeymoon in the Maldives. The guest list included several of our mutual business associates, people who regularly sat across from me in board meetings. The betrayal extended beyond just our marriage. It reached into every aspect of our professional lives. What James didn't know was that Robert Hayes had already flagged several suspicious transactions to the Thompson Investment Group's board. The seemingly routine business expenses he'd been claiming were easily traced to wedding preparations, venue deposits disguised as property development costs, engagement ring purchases hidden within construction material orders. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. He'd forwarded an email chain detailing how James had been reallocating resources from existing projects to fund his secret wedding preparations. The message included a note of apology. "I should have said something sooner." He swore it was all above board. The city lights began to twinkle as dusk settled over Seattle. Sophie and I remained in her office, methodically working through each document, building a comprehensive understanding of just how extensive James's deception had become. The wedding plans were just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath them lay a carefully constructed scheme to secure his financial future using my family's assets. What he's done, Sophie explained, her legal expertise evident in her careful choice of words, isn't just a personal betrayal. There are serious financial implications. She pulled out another file, this one containing records of how James had misrepresented his authority over certain assets when securing new business deals. The evening grew darker as we continued our review. Each document told part of a larger story, one of calculated deception and careful planning. Yet in all his meticulous preparation, James had overlooked the most crucial detail. The very foundation of his plans rested on assets he didn't actually control. A slight smile crossed my face as I realized the full extent of his oversight. While he'd been planning his secret wedding, I'd been quietly consolidating my control over our shared business interests. Each board meeting I'd attended, every charity function I'd hosted, every business lunch I'd organized, all had served to strengthen my position within Seattle's business community. The city lights blurred below as tears finally filled my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the sheer audacity of it all. How had he thought he would get away with this? Did he really believe I wouldn't notice? Or had he simply underestimated me so completely that he thought I wouldn't understand the complexity of his financial maneuvers? Sophie reached across her desk and squeezed my hand, her gesture offering support rather than sympathy. We both knew what needed to happen next. The evidence was clear, the documentation complete. Now it was time to act, to show James exactly who he'd underestimated. Outside, Seattle's nightlife was coming alive, the streets filling with people heading to dinner or evening events. Somewhere in this city, James was probably with Olivia, perhaps finalizing details for their wedding, blissfully unaware that their carefully laid plans were about to unravel. The thought brought a calmness I hadn't expected, the kind of peace that comes with finally seeing the complete picture and knowing exactly what needs to be done. The planning phase required precision that would rival any surgical procedure. In my home office, overlooking the Seattle skyline, I began meticulously arranging the pieces of my response. Each document was carefully organized, every detail accounted for, as I prepared to dismantle the life James thought he had secured. Robert Hayes arrived early that morning, his leather briefcase containing the final pieces we needed. The morning light filtered through the rain-streaked windows as we reviewed the trust documents, highlighting key clauses that James had conveniently overlooked in his ambitious planning. The coffee grew cold in our cups as we traced ownership, paths and control structures, mapping out the exact steps needed to protect my interests. At my request, the Thompson Investment Group had scheduled an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. The timing was deliberate. It would coincide perfectly with James's final wedding venue walkthrough at the Four Seasons. The thought of him standing there, discussing flower arrangements and table settings while his professional world quietly imploded, brought a certain satisfaction. Sophie had been instrumental in preparing the legal framework. Her office had become a second command center where we orchestrated each move with calculated precision. The documentation was impeccable. Every transfer, every signature, every decision backed by years of careful record-keeping that my father had insisted upon. The afternoon sun broke through Seattle's persistent clouds as Marcus arrived with the final audits of Wilson and Bennett Development. His face showed the strain of recent weeks, the conflict between loyalty to his business partner and his moral compass evident in the deep lines around his eyes. The files he brought revealed the full extent of James's financial maneuvering, creative accounting that would soon come under intense scrutiny. My laptop chimed with an email from the Four Seasons management. They had been surprisingly cooperative once presented with evidence of James's financial misrepresentations. The venue contract, signed under questionable pretenses, would be void by tomorrow morning. Let Olivia deal with finding a new location for their fairy tale wedding. The security team at the Parker Street development had proven invaluable, providing detailed logs of every after-hours visit, every private meeting that had nothing to do with interior design. Their reports painted a clear picture of James's extracurricular activities, each entry another nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed deception. Evening settled over the city as I finalized the last details with my private investigator. Her findings had been thorough. Every dinner reservation, every hotel check-in, every hidden purchase meticulously documented. The evidence she'd gathered would ensure that when the time came, there would be no room for denial or negotiation. The transformation of our shared office space had begun subtly. Each day, another photo disappeared from the walls, another personal item removed from my desk. The space was being systematically stripped of any trace of our partnership, both personal and professional. James, too preoccupied with his secret wedding plans, hadn't even noticed. My phone buzzed with updates from the accounting team. They had traced every dollar James had diverted, every resource he'd misappropriated. The spreadsheets told a story of systematic deception, of a man so confident in his control that he'd left an obvious trail. Tomorrow, that same confidence would be his undoing. The catering company called to confirm the cancellation of their services. They'd been apologetic, professional, and most importantly, discreet. Another piece of James and Olivia's perfect day quietly dismantled. The same scene was playing out across Seattle. Vendors, suppliers, and service providers all receiving similar notifications. Rain began to fall again as I reviewed the guest list for their planned ceremony. Names jumped out at me: business associates, clients, even members of my own social circle. Each person on that list represented a connection that James thought he owned, not realizing how many of them owed their loyalty to the Thompson family. Name. The clock on my desk showed well past midnight as I finished preparing the documents for tomorrow's board meeting. Each page represented another aspect of James's world that would soon be beyond his reach. The properties he'd leveraged, the contracts he'd signed, the deals he'd made, all of it built on a foundation he didn't actually control. My father's portrait watched over me as I worked, his stern expression a reminder of why he'd insisted on keeping the family trust separate from my marriage. He'd seen something in James that I'd been too blinded by love to recognize, a hunger for power that overshadowed any genuine emotion. The final piece arrived via courier just before dawn, documentation from the bank confirming the freeze on specific accounts and assets. The timing was crucial. Everything had to happen in perfect sequence. Like dominoes arranged with careful precision, each action would trigger the next, creating a cascade that would leave nothing of James's carefully constructed world standing. Seattle awakened to rare clear skies, the morning sun illuminating Mount Rainier in the distance. In a few hours, James would arrive at the Four Seasons, expecting to finalize details for his new beginning. Instead, he would find himself facing an ending he hadn't anticipated. The thought brought neither joy nor sadness, only a calm certainty that justice was about to be served. The morning traffic built up outside as I made my final preparations. Each document was in its place, every detail attended to. Now it was simply a matter of waiting for the perfect moment to set everything in motion. James had always prided himself on his strategic thinking, but he was about to learn that he wasn't the only one capable of planning ahead. The confrontation unfolded at Canlis, Seattle's most prestigious restaurant, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Union. I had chosen this venue deliberately. It was where James had first proposed, where we'd celebrated countless business deals, and where tonight, his carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. James sat across from me, his confident smile never quite reaching his eyes as he studied the wine list. The soft lighting caught the silver. At his temples, a distinguished touch that had once made my heart skip. Now I noticed how his hands fidgeted with his wedding ring, a nervous tell he'd developed in recent months. Olivia arrived precisely on schedule, wearing a black Chanel dress that probably cost more than her monthly interior design fee. Her presence was part of my design, an orchestrated piece in this evening's performance. She hesitated at the entrance, spotting us at our usual table. confusion flickering across her perfectly made-up face. The sommelier approached with a bottle of James's favorite Bordeaux, unaware of the tension building at our table. I watched as James's expression shifted from confusion to alarm when Olivia began walking toward us. He hadn't expected this. Hadn't anticipated that I would arrange for all three of us to be here together. "What a lovely surprise," I said, my voice carrying just enough warmth to appear genuine to nearby diners. "Please join us. We were just discussing the Parker Street development." The look that passed between them spoke volumes, a silent conversation of panic and uncertainty. The city lights twinkled beyond the glass as Olivia reluctantly took her seat. James's complexion had paled slightly, his usual confidence wavering as he realized this wasn't a chance encounter. The waiter appeared with an extra wine glass, and I took control of the bottle, pouring generously for each of us. "To new beginnings," I offered, raising my glass. The irony of my toast wasn't lost on anyone at the table. James took a large swallow of wine, while Olivia barely touched hers. The fear in her eyes suggested she knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite grasp what was happening. The executive chef, an old family friend, sent over an amuse-bouche, delicate spoonfuls of caviar and creme fraiche. I watched as James struggled to maintain his composure, his eyes darting between Olivia and me. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time, he wasn't in control. "The Four Seasons called today," I mentioned casually, watching their reactions. Apparently, there was some confusion about a booking for next month. James's fork clattered against his plate, the sound sharp in the elegant dining room. Olivia's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. The evening air grew thick with unspoken words as I pulled out a manila envelope from my designer bag. "I thought we should discuss some paperwork," I continued, my voice steady. There seemed to be some discrepancies in the recent property transfers. Seattle's lights created a glittering backdrop as I laid out document after document. Bank statements, property deeds, transfer records. Each piece of paper, another nail in the coffin of James's deception. His face grew increasingly ashen as he realized the extent of my knowledge. "How did you—" he started, but I cut him off with a gentle shake of my head. The other diners continued their meals, oblivious to the drama unfolding at our table. This was Seattle's upper echelon. Appearances had to be maintained, even in moments of crisis. Olivia's mascara had begun to smudge slightly at the corners of her eyes. The confident interior designer who had planned to step into my life was crumbling under the weight of reality. She hadn't known about the Thompson family trust, about the true ownership of the assets James had promised her. The waiter appeared, with our main courses, perfectly seared scallops that no one would touch. James attempted to regain control, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We can discuss this privately," he insisted. But I merely smiled and took another sip of wine. "I think we're past privacy, don't you?" I replied, sliding another document across the table. "Especially given the guest list for your upcoming event." The paper contained names of Seattle's business elite, people who would soon learn exactly how James had attempted to manipulate his way into their social circle. The sound of gentle jazz from the restaurant's piano player provided an elegant soundtrack to the unfolding scene. I watched as James's hands began to shake slightly, his carefully maintained facade cracking under pressure. Olivia looked like she wanted to disappear into her expensive dress. "The Thompson Investment Group board meets tomorrow morning," I continued, my voice carrying just enough edge to make both of them flinch. "They're particularly interested in reviewing some recent financial decisions." James's face went completely white. He knew what that meant. Outside, a ferry's horn sounded across the water, its mournful tone oddly appropriate for the moment. I reached into my bag once more, producing a final set of papers. "These require your immediate attention," I said, sliding them toward James. "Unless you'd prefer to discuss everything in a more public forum." The evening had entered its final act. I watched as James scanned the documents, his legal training allowing him to quickly grasp their implications. Everything he had built using my family's resources was about to be dismantled. His dream of a new life with Olivia, funded by Thompson money, was evaporating before his eyes. A nearby table ordered champagne, their celebration creating a stark contrast to our quiet drama. Olivia's phone buzzed, probably the wedding planner, unaware that there would be no ceremony next month. James loosened his tie slightly, a rare display of discomfort in his usually polished appearance. I signaled for the check, my decision made long before this dinner began. The restaurant's soft lighting caught the diamond on my finger, the ring, that had once symbolized our partnership, now just another asset to be divided. Tomorrow, Seattle's business community would wake up to a very different reality. The turning point arrived with the precision of a perfectly executed business deal. Morning light streamed through the Thompson Investment Group's boardroom windows. As James strode in, his confidence still intact, unaware that everything was about to change. The mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lighting, each leather chair occupied by a board member who had known my father, who had watched me grow up, who had seen through James's facade long before I had. Robert Hayes sat at the far end, his silver hair catching the light as he organized the morning's documentation. The quarterly financial reports lay before each seat, but these weren't the routine statements James was expecting. Inside each folder was a detailed accounting of every misappropriated dollar, every fraudulent transaction, every asset he had leveraged without proper authorization. The Seattle skyline provided a dramatic backdrop as James took his usual seat, straightening his custom-made suit jacket. He nodded to several board members, his practiced charm on full display. Marcus arrived moments later, choosing a seat far from his business partner, the weight of what was to come evident in his careful avoidance of eye contact. "Before we begin," I announced, standing at the head of the table where my father had once presided, "there are some urgent matters requiring our immediate attention." The subtle shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Board members straightened in their chairs, their expressions grave as they opened their folders. James reached for his own folder, his manicured fingers trembling slightly as he lifted the cover. I watched his face as he scanned the first page, saw the exact moment he realized what was happening. The color drained from his face, his practiced smile faltering for the first time since he'd entered the room. "As you can see," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "we've uncovered several concerning discrepancies in recent financial transactions." The projector hummed to life, displaying a detailed flowchart of funds moving through various accounts, all leading back to properties and investments James had intended for his new life with Olivia. The morning sun cast long shadows across the boardroom as James attempted to interrupt, but Robert Hayes cleared his throat, a sound that carried decades of authority. "I suggest you review the documentation thoroughly before making any statements. Mr. Wilson." The use of his surname rather than the familiar James marked the shift in his status. A light rain began to fall outside, Seattle's trademark weather providing a fitting backdrop to the unfolding scene. Board members murmured among themselves as they reviewed the evidence, their expressions growing increasingly stern. These were people who had built their reputations on integrity, who valued the Thompson name and all it represented. James's phone buzzed. Probably Olivia, wondering why he wasn't at their scheduled wedding venue walkthrough. He silenced it without looking, his attention fixed on the damning evidence before him. Each page revealed another layer of his deception, another carefully planned move that was now backfiring spectacularly. The presentation continued, methodically outlining every instance where James had overstepped his authority. Property acquisitions. Made without proper approval, funds diverted through questionable channels, contracts signed under misrepresented pretenses, all of it documented with irrefutable clarity. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat as his own role came under scrutiny. While not directly complicit in James's schemes, he had turned a blind eye to many questionable decisions. His future at Wilson and Bennett Development now hung in the balance, dependent on his cooperation in the coming investigations. A senior board member, who had worked alongside my father for 30 years, removed his glasses and fixed James with a penetrating stare. "Would you care to explain these discrepancies, Mr. Wilson?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implied consequences. James loosened his tie slightly, his composure cracking under the collective scrutiny. Security personnel appeared discreetly at the boardroom doors, a necessary precaution given the magnitude of what was transpiring. I had seen enough corporate takedowns to know that desperation could lead to unpredictable behavior. James noticed them too, his eyes darting between the exits as reality began to sink in. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the Seattle skyline beyond the windows. Somewhere out there, at the Four Seasons, a wedding planner was probably wondering why neither the groom nor his bride had arrived for their appointment. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a sense of justice being served. Robert Hayes began distributing another set of documents, legal papers that would sever James's connection to the Thompson family's assets. The soft sound of papers being passed along the table was the only noise in the room. Each board member signed without hesitation, their pens scratching against paper like final nails in a coffin. James's hands shook visibly as he reached for his water glass. The man who had swept into my life with such confidence, who had built his reputation on charm and calculated risks, was watching his carefully constructed world dissolve. The property portfolio he'd assembled, the business connections he'd cultivated, the future he'd planned, all of it built on a foundation he didn't actually control. A gentle knock at the door signaled the arrival of the legal team from Sophie's firm. They entered quietly, their presence marking the transition from corporate meeting to legal proceeding. Each carried briefcases containing additional documentation: cease and desist orders, property liens, asset freezes, all prepared in advance and ready to be executed. The rain intensified outside, drops streaking down the windows like tears Seattle was crying for a dynasty that never was. James finally found his voice, attempting to mount a defense, but his words rang hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. The board members listened with stony expressions, years of business experience allowing them to see through his desperate explanations. Marcus excused himself quietly, unable to watch his former partner's downfall. His own future would need to be addressed, but for now, he was just another witness to the dismantling of James Wilson's ambitions. The door closed softly behind him, leaving James increasingly isolated at the table. The morning had turned into a professional execution, each document signed, each decision recorded, each asset reclaimed by its rightful owners. The Thompson family name would endure, its reputation perhaps even strengthened by this display of decisive action in the face of betrayal. The emotional aftermath settled over me like Seattle's familiar morning fog as I sat in my father's old study, now mine, within our family's Mercer Island estate. The leather chair still held his imprint, a reminder of the countless hours he'd spent teaching me about business, about trust, about reading people. The morning light filtered through rain-streaked windows, casting gentle shadows across the antique desk where I now processed everything that had transpired. My fingers traced the edge of a photograph taken at last year's charity gala, James and I standing together, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling at the camera. It seemed impossible that just 12 months ago I had still believed in the life we'd built. The frame made a soft thud as I placed it face down on the desk. The soft chime of my phone drew my attention to a message from Sophie. Another client had withdrawn from Wilson and Bennett Development, citing concerns about recent revelations. The domino effect was in full swing, each falling piece exactly as we'd predicted. James's reputation in Seattle's business community was crumbling faster than the autumn leaves outside my window. Rain tapped against the window panes as I reviewed the morning's financial reports. The Thompson Investment Group's stock had actually risen since the news broke, the market responding favorably to our swift and decisive action. My father would have been proud of how we'd handled the crisis, protecting not just our assets, but the reputation he'd spent a lifetime building. A gentle knock at the door preceded Martha, our housekeeper of 20 years, bringing in a fresh pot of tea. Her eyes held a mixture of concern and relief as she set the silver service down. "Your mother called again," she said softly. "She's worried about you being here alone." I smiled, appreciating their concern, but knowing I needed this solitude to process everything. The tea's steam rose in delicate spirals as I poured a cup, its familiar Earl Grey scent grounding me in the present moment. My mother didn't understand that I wasn't hiding. I was centering myself, finding strength in the very rooms where I'd learned about power, responsibility, and the true meaning of legacy. Robert Hayes's latest email detailed the continuing fallout. 3 more development projects had been frozen pending full financial audits. The client list James had so carefully cultivated was dissolving, each investor eager to distance themselves from the scandal. His carefully constructed house of cards was falling, each revelation bringing new consequences. My attention turned to a stack of RSVPs on the desk, responses to next month's annual Thompson Foundation Gala. Several of Seattle's most prominent families had already confirmed their attendance, a clear signal that they were aligning themselves with the Thompson name rather than James's tarnished reputation. Social warfare in Seattle was always subtle but decisive. The sound of rain intensified as I opened my laptop, reviewing the latest press coverage. Local business journals had picked up the story, their headlines carefully worded but unmistakable in their implications. James's fall from grace was becoming public knowledge, his reputation unraveling thread by thread in the media he'd once courted so successfully. A text message lit up my phone. Olivia, surprisingly. Her name on the screen caused a complex wave of emotions. Rather than anger, I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. She too had been deceived, led to believe in promises built on borrowed power and stolen dreams. Her message was simple. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon as I considered my response. In the end, I chose silence. Some betrayals ran too deep for words. Some apologies came too late to matter. Let her live with the consequences of her choices, just as I was living with mine. Thunder rolled in the distance as I reviewed the latest reports from the property management company. The Parker Street development, where James and Olivia had spent so many planning sessions, was being rebranded. All traces of Wilson and Bennett's involvement were being systematically erased, the project returning fully under Thompson Group control. A fresh stack of documents arrived via courier, transfer papers requiring my signature. Each page represented another piece of James's world being reclaimed, another asset returning to its rightful ownership. My signature flowed smoothly across, each line, years of practice making the motion automatic, definitive. The rain eased as afternoon light softened the study's shadows. A photo album lay open on the side table, pages filled with memories from charity events, business launches, social gatherings. Each image now held new meaning, each smile concealing truths I hadn't been ready to see. These weren't just photographs anymore. They were evidence of a masterful performance that had finally reached its end. Sophie's afternoon update brought news of more client departures from Wilson and Bennett. The exodus was gaining momentum, each withdrawal adding pressure to James's increasingly precarious position. His once impressive client portfolio was evaporating, leaving behind only questions and damaged trust. Martha returned with fresh tea and a concerned expression. "There are reporters at the gate again," she reported quietly. The media attention had been building steadily, each new revelation feeding their hunger for details. But the Thompson family had always understood the value of silence, of letting actions speak louder than words. The study's warmth contrasted sharply with the chill I felt reading Marcus's latest email. He was cooperating fully with the auditors, providing details of James's financial maneuvers that even I hadn't known about. His testimony would be crucial in the coming weeks as the full extent of the deception came to light. Evening approached, painting the sky in muted shades of gray and purple. From my window, I could see lights beginning to twinkle across the lake, each one a reminder of the life I was reclaiming. The betrayal still stung, but it no longer held the power to break me. Instead, it had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. Darkness settled over the estate as I finally closed my laptop. The day's developments had unfolded exactly as planned, each move bringing us closer to a complete resolution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new opportunities to demonstrate exactly who controlled the empire James had tried to claim as his own. The climactic board meeting at Thompson Investment Group headquarters pulsed with an energy that even the floor-to-ceiling windows couldn't contain. Seattle's morning fog had lifted, revealing a crystal-clear view of the city James had tried to conquer. Every seat around the mahogany table was filled. Board members, legal representatives, and key stakeholders all gathered for what would become a defining moment in Seattle's business history. James arrived precisely on schedule, his Armani suit, and carefully styled hair a stark contrast to his ashen complexion. He'd aged years in the past week, the strain of watching his carefully constructed world crumble evident in every line of his face. The security guards positioned at each exit tracked his movement with practiced discretion. Robert Hayes stood at the podium, his voice carrying decades of authority as he began presenting the final audit findings. The projector hummed to life, displaying spreadsheet after spreadsheet of fraudulent transactions, unauthorized transfers, and misappropriated funds. Each slide revealed another layer of deception, another carefully hidden manipulation of Thompson family assets. Marcus sat opposite James, his former partner now a key witness to the systematic dismantling of their shared empire. His testimony had been devastating. Detailed accounts of how James had leveraged Thompson resources, manipulated contracts, and diverted funds for his personal ventures. The evidence was irrefutable, each document bearing James's own signature. The morning, light intensified as Sophie's legal team distributed the final resolution papers. The rustle of pages turning filled the room as board members reviewed the terms. Complete severance of all ties between James Wilson and Thompson Investment Group. Immediate transfer of all properties and assets back to their rightful ownership, and full disclosure of all financial dealings during his tenure. James's phone buzzed insistently. Probably Olivia, or perhaps his lawyer, trying to reach him before the final decisions were made. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on the documentation before him. The prenuptial agreement he'd once thought so clever now revealed itself as another miscalculation, its clauses working against him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The board members' expressions remained impassive as they reviewed the evidence, years of business experience allowing them to fully grasp the magnitude of James's deception. These were people who had known my father, who understood the weight of the Thompson legacy. Their judgment would be swift and absolute. A senior partner from Sophie's firm approached the podium, outlining the legal ramifications of James's actions. Words like fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty echoed through the room. Each charge was backed by meticulous documentation, leaving no room for denial or negotiation. The Seattle skyline provided a dramatic backdrop as James finally rose to speak. His voice, once so confident in these meetings, now wavered as he attempted to explain his actions. But the evidence spoke louder than any justification he could offer. Years of manipulation and deceit laid bare before the very people he'd tried to impress. Martha had delivered fresh coffee and water, moving silently through the room like a ghost. Her presence reminded me of countless other meetings, other turning points in the Thompson family history. She'd witnessed it all, her quiet dignity a constant through generations of business dealings. The morning wore on as resolution after resolution was presented and approved, each vote another nail in the coffin of James's ambitions. The Thompson Investment Group's future was being secured, its assets protected, its reputation preserved through decisive action and unwavering resolve. Robert Hayes called for the final vote, the formal removal of James Wilson from all positions within the organization. Hands raised in unanimous agreement, a forest of conviction rising against the man who had dared to threaten the Thompson legacy. The decision was recorded with meticulous care, becoming part of the official record. Security moved closer as James's composure finally cracked. His hands trembled as he gathered his papers, his wedding ring catching the light one last time before disappearing into his pocket. The man who had swept into my life with such confidence was leaving as a shadow of himself, stripped of power and pretense. The city continued its busy pace beyond the windows, unaware of the drama unfolding in this boardroom. Somewhere out there, Olivia was probably still clinging to hopes of salvaging something from the wreckage. But there would be no rescue, no last-minute reprieve, no way to rebuild what had been so thoroughly destroyed. Sophie's team began collecting signed documents, each page another piece of evidence in the complete dismantling of James Wilson's attempted takeover. The legal machinery would continue moving, ensuring that every aspect of his deception was exposed and addressed. The board members gathered their belongings, their duty discharged with the precision and gravity it deserved. They had protected the Thompson name, upheld the principles my father had established, and sent a clear message to Seattle's business community about the consequences of betrayal. As the room slowly emptied, I remained seated at the head of the table, feeling the weight of my father's legacy. The morning sun cast my shadow across the polished wood, a silhouette of strength and determination. James paused at the door, perhaps wanting to say something, but no words could bridge the chasm. His actions had created. The final papers were filed, the last signatures recorded, the decisions set in motion. Seattle's business landscape had shifted, realigning itself around the undeniable truth that the Thompson family's power remained undiminished, its authority absolute in the face of attempted usurpation. Seattle's financial district buzzed with the aftermath as I watched from the Thompson Tower's executive suite. Rain streaked down the windows, distorting the city lights into watercolor smudges. The media had caught wind of the story. James Wilson's spectacular fall from grace now occupied prime spots in business journals and social columns alike. My office had become a sanctuary of sorts, its walls absorbing the shockwaves rippling through Seattle's business community. Sophie arrived with fresh coffee and the morning's headlines. The Seattle Times business section featured a particularly unflattering photo of James leaving the Thompson Investment Group building, his face a mask of defeat beneath his designer umbrella. The Thompson family name remained untarnished, our swift and decisive action earning quiet approval from the city's elite. Invitations to upcoming social events continued to arrive, each one a subtle confirmation that society had chosen its side. The annual charity gala would proceed as planned, though with one notable absence from the guest list. A text message from Marcus illuminated my phone screen. Wilson and Bennett Development was being dissolved, its projects redistributed among more reliable partners. The Parker Street property, once intended as a love nest for James and Olivia, would now be completed under Thompson Group supervision, its luxury apartments a testament to proper management and legitimate funding. The afternoon light softened as Robert Hayes presented the latest financial reports. Our stock had not only stabilized but strengthened, the market responding favorably to our handling of the crisis. Each decision, each careful move had served to reinforce the Thompson family's position in Seattle's business hierarchy. Olivia's resignation letter arrived by courier, formal, professionally worded, but carrying an undercurrent of desperate recognition. Her interior design career in Seattle was effectively over. The social circles she'd hoped to enter had closed ranks, protecting their own against what they saw as an attempted infiltration. Martha brought in tea as I reviewed the latest property: transfers. The Mercer Island estate, which James had once hoped to claim, remained securely in Thompson family hands. Its gardens would bloom next spring without him. Its rooms would hold new memories, its future untainted by his presence. The setting sun painted Mount Rainier in shades of pink and gold as Sophie's team finalized the last legal documents. Each page represented another door closing, another connection severed, another piece of James's world being systematically dismantled. His attempts to contact me had ceased, reality finally sinking in. Evening news programs ran segments analyzing the business implications of James's downfall. Financial experts dissected his mistakes, pointing out the hubris that had led him to believe he could outmaneuver the Thompson family's generations of careful planning and strategic foresight. My mother called from Paris, her concern evident, even across the distance. She had warned me about men like James, had seen through his charm to the ambition beneath. Now she offered quiet support, understanding that some lessons must be learned firsthand, some battles fought alone. The city. Lights began to twinkle as I sorted through old photographs, separating memories from evidence. Each image told a story of calculated deception: charity galas, business launches, social events where James had played his part while plotting his escape. These would be archived, not destroyed, a reminder of lessons learned. Security reports detailed James's movements, his departure from his club membership, the cancellation of his social engagements, the quiet withdrawal from Seattle's elite circles. His world had contracted rapidly, the influence he'd thought was his revealed as merely borrowed power. Late night brought a final email from Robert Hayes. The Thompson Investment Group's board had approved a complete restructuring of our security protocols. Future attempts to manipulate our assets would face even stronger safeguards, our legacy protected by layers of carefully crafted oversight. My office overlooked the same skyline James had once coveted, its gleaming towers and busy streets continuing their eternal dance. Seattle's business community had witnessed a masterclass in consequence, a reminder that true power lies not in appearances, but in foundations built on integrity and careful stewardship. A gentle knock announced Martha's evening round. She collected, the tea service with practiced grace, her presence a reminder of the constants that had sustained our family through generations of challenges. Some loyalties run deeper than ambition. Some truths stand stronger than deception. The night deepened as I reviewed plans for the Thompson Foundation's upcoming initiatives. Life would continue, projects would progress, our influence would grow, not through manipulation, but through the steady application of principles my father had instilled. James's attempt to hijack our legacy had only served to strengthen it. Rain returned, washing the city in sheets of silver. Somewhere out there, James faced his first night of true reckoning, his dreams of power and position dissolved like morning mist. The wedding venue he'd booked would host another couple's celebration. The future he'd planned now nothing more than a cautionary tale in Seattle's social history. The final threads of autumn sunlight streamed through my office window at Thompson Tower as I signed the last document finalizing James's complete removal from Seattle's business landscape. The city sprawled below, unchanged, yet fundamentally different from when this all began. The morning headlines had long since moved on to other stories, but the ripples of what happened still moved through the circles of power. The Thompson Investment Group had emerged stronger, its reputation enhanced by the swift and decisive handling of James's attempted coup. New partnerships formed, stronger alliances built on the foundation of proven integrity. The Parker Street development, now under complete Thompson control, had become one of the most sought-after properties in the city. Sophie delivered the final report from her legal team, a comprehensive document detailing every aspect of James's scheme and its systematic dismantling. The evidence would be archived, a testament to the importance of vigilance and the true nature of power. Some lessons need to be preserved for future generations. Marcus had rebuilt his reputation, his cooperation during the crisis earning him a path to redemption. Wilson and Bennett Development was now just Bennett Enterprises, its projects carefully vetted, its operations transparent. He had learned the value of choosing the right allies, of building success on solid ground rather than shifting sand. Olivia's wedding dress still hung unclaimed at the boutique, a ghost of futures that would never materialize. She had left Seattle, quietly, her dreams of social ascension evaporating like morning fog. The Four Seasons had long since filled her canceled wedding date with another celebration, life moving forward as it always does. The autumn rain returned, drawing patterns on my window as I reviewed the latest financial projections. The Thompson family's influence had grown, our position in Seattle's business community strengthened by the very challenge that was meant to undermine it. Sometimes power reveals itself most clearly when tested. Martha brought afternoon tea, her quiet presence a reminder of the constants that anchored our world. The silver service reflected the office lights, its polished surface showing nothing of the storms it had weathered. Some things remain untarnished, their value lying in their steadfast nature rather than their shine. The city lights began their evening dance as I closed my laptop. Another day of careful stewardship coming to an end. James's last attempt to contact me had been returned unopened, his words unnecessary in the face of actions that had spoken so clearly. Some chapters need no epilogue, their endings written in the consequences they create. Seattle's social calendar continued its eternal round, though with subtle adjustments. The annual Thompson Foundation Gala would proceed with its usual elegance, its guest list reflecting the new reality of power and influence. Some absences speak louder than any presence could. Night fell over the city as I gathered my things, ready to return to the Mercer Island estate. The gardens there would need attention soon, preparation for winter, an annual ritual that connected present to past. Some roots run too deep to be shaken by temporary storms. The security team's final report detailed James's departure from Seattle, a quiet exit from the city he had tried to conquer. His ambitions had dissolved like wine in water, leaving behind only the bitter taste of lessons learned too late. Some defeats carry the seeds of greater victories within them. My father's portrait watched over the office, his expression seeming to hold new wisdom in the evening light. He had understood the true nature of power, had built our legacy on foundations stronger than any individual's ambition. Some inheritances prove their worth most clearly in times of crisis. The city continued its busy pace below, unaware of the quiet triumph taking place in the towers above. The Thompson name remained untarnished, its power undiminished, its future secure in hands that understood the responsibility of stewardship. Some victories need no fanfare to resonate through generations. The night deepened as I made my final preparations to leave. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to demonstrate the principles that had guided our family through generations of success. Some endings mark only the beginning of stronger beginnings. Seattle's lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth, each one a reminder of the dreams and ambitions that drove the city forward. The Thompson legacy would continue, stronger for having weathered this storm, more prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. Some powers grow strongest when tested by fire. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these. Just click and check them out.